A rich man humiliated a cleaning lady at a reception, but everything changed when he found out who owned the building. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and post in the comments where you're watching from. The Grand Hall of the New York City Cultural Center was alive with anticipation. For months, its management had worked tirelessly to ensure that tonight's charity gala would be an unforgettable event. The hall, a masterpiece of restored Art Deco architecture, stood as a symbol of prestige and timeless beauty. Its gleaming marble floors reflected the glow of the crystal chandeliers above, while towering columns lined the perimeter, giving the space a majestic air. Every detail down to the last polished piece of silverware was a testament to the perfection the event demanded. Tonight's occasion was not merely a fundraiser, it was a statement. Hosted by the renowned philanthropist and billionaire Richard Weston, the gala aimed to raise funds for underprivileged youth, providing scholarships and opportunities for those in need. Weston, a man celebrated for his unwavering commitment to equality and justice, had spared no expense to ensure the evening was flawless. Guests would include prominent politicians, celebrities, and the wealthiest figures in the city. Every individual in attendance was expected to contribute generously, both in donations and by showcasing their influence. Behind the scenes, the true engine of the event churned tirelessly. Dozens of staff members moved like clockwork, ensuring the tables were set, the floral arrangements were perfect, and every surface gleamed. Among them was Martha Brown. Martha was a woman who had seen more years than most of her colleagues, her hands calloused from decades of work. Her back slightly hunched, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her years of hardship. Her uniform was spotless, and her movements, though deliberate, were efficient. Martha had been working as a cleaner in the cultural center for over a decade. But her story stretched far beyond the marble walls of this hall. In her younger years, Martha had dreamed of becoming a teacher. Her love for learning and her compassion for others had driven her to pursue an education. But life had a way of derailing even the most hopeful plans. The unexpected loss of her husband had left her to raise a family alone, and those dreams were set aside to prioritize survival. Over the years, Martha had taken any job she could find, waitressing, housekeeping, factory work, just to make ends meet. Now, with her children grown, she worked tirelessly to support her granddaughter, whose medical needs required constant care. For Martha, this job was more than just a paycheck. It was a way to contribute, however quietly, to something greater than herself. She took pride in her work, ensuring that every corner of the hall sparkled. She often arrived before sunrise, preparing the space for the day ahead, and stayed long after the events concluded, cleaning up after the city's elite. Her efforts were invisible to most, but she didn't mind. She believed in the importance of creating beauty and order, even if no one noticed. On this particular evening, the weight of the event seemed heavier than usual. The scale of the gala meant that every detail had to be perfect, and the pressure trickled down to even the smallest tasks. Martha worked methodically, scrubbing scuffs from the marble tiles near the stage, carefully avoiding the arrangements of candles and floral displays that adorned the area. She knew this floor would soon be graced by the heels of high society guests, and she wanted it to gleam under the light. Elsewhere in the hall, the event planners were abuzz with activity. Servers practiced their movements with trays of champagne glasses, caterers adjusted the presentation of canapes, and technicians tested the lighting and sound systems. Despite the frenetic pace, there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. Tonight wasn't just an event, it was a show of power, wealth, and benevolence. As Martha worked, she caught snippets of conversation from the staff around her. They spoke in hushed tones about the guests who would be attending, including Daniel Carter, the media mogul whose presence always turned heads. Known for his sharp wit and controversial opinions, Carter was as polarizing as he was powerful. Some admired his business acumen and influence, while others despised his unapologetically arrogant demeanor and the casual bigotry that often laced his remarks. Martha didn't know much about him beyond the headlines, but his reputation made her uneasy. Despite the grandeur of the evening, Martha couldn't shake a quiet unease that had settled over her as she worked. She chalked it up to the usual nerves that accompanied such high-profile events. She was determined to stay focused, ensuring that her role in the evening went unnoticed, just the way she preferred it. As the hours ticked by and the final preparations fell into place, the hall began to transform. The first guests would be arriving soon, dressed in their finest attire, ready to bask in the glow of opulence and philanthropy. The stage was set, and the spotlight would soon shine on the city's elite. Yet, in the shadows, Martha continued her work, oblivious to the storm that was quietly brewing, one that would place her in the center of a confrontation she could never have anticipated. As the evening descended on Manhattan, the Grand Hall of the Cultural Center became a hive of activity. Outside, luxury cars lined the streets, their chauffeurs carefully maneuvering through the bustling crowd. Paparazzi stationed at the entrance snapped photos of arriving guests, their cameras flashing like strobe lights against the dusk. The city's elite were gathering, draped in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, each arrival another spectacle for onlookers to admire. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was taut with expectation. The staff moved with precision, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The lighting crew adjusted the chandeliers for the optimal glow, servers polished the last of the silverware, and event planners triple-checked the seating arrangements. It was the kind of evening where even the smallest mistake could ripple outward, affecting the entire event. Among the staff, there was a whispered buzz of anticipation. Daniel Carter was expected to arrive any moment. The mere mention of his name sparked a mixture of awe and apprehension. As the CEO of one of the largest media empires in the country, Carter was a man of immense power and influence. His presence at the gala was a statement, not just of his wealth, but of his control over public narratives. What he chose to support often shaped public opinion, and his approval was as valuable as the seven-figure donations he frequently made. But Carter was also known for his sharp tongue and an arrogance that bordered on cruelty. His controversial comments, often veiled as humor, had made him a polarizing figure. Many admired his unapologetic confidence, while others saw him as a symbol of unchecked privilege. Tonight, his attendance was both a boon and a challenge for the gala's hosts. When Carter's car pulled up to the red carpet, it was as though the air shifted. A sleek black Rolls-Royce came to a stop, and a driver quickly exited to open the door. Out stepped Daniel Carter, exuding the effortless confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He was dressed impeccably in a dark, tailored suit, his silver cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted his jacket. His chiseled features and steely gray eyes scanned the scene with practiced indifference, as though it all barely merited his notice. He walked toward the entrance with long, deliberate strides, his presence alone parting the crowd like a knife through water. Behind him trailed his assistants, each clutching tablets and folders ready to respond to his every whim. The camera flashes intensified, and the murmurs from the surrounding guests grew louder. Inside, the event planners scrambled to ensure Carter's entrance went smoothly. The gala's host, Richard Weston, had personally requested that Carter be treated with the utmost care. Weston understood the weight of Carter's influence and knew that his presence could elevate the event's status. However, Weston also knew of Carter's reputation for being difficult. It was a fine line to walk, welcoming Carter without letting his behavior overshadow the evening. Carter entered the hall with an air of detached superiority. His sharp eyes surveyed the opulent surroundings, taking in the lavish decor and meticulously arranged tables. He offered a faint nod of approval, though it was unclear whether it was for the venue or simply a reflexive acknowledgement of his own expectations being met. As he moved through the hall, Carter's attention was drawn to the staff. To him, they were part of the scenery, functional but unremarkable. His gaze lingered on a young waiter who was nervously balancing a tray of champagne flutes, then shifted to a florist making last-minute adjustments to a centerpiece. There was no recognition in his eyes, only the detached scrutiny of someone who viewed people as tools rather than individuals. And then he noticed Martha. She was near the far end of the hall, her figure partially obscured by a column as she cleaned the base of a towering arrangement of white roses. Her uniform, though neat and pressed, was a stark contrast to the dazzling attire of the guests. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her posture slightly hunched as she focused on her task. To Carter, she was an anomaly, a reminder of a world he preferred to ignore. Carter's expression shifted ever so slightly, a faint curl of his lip betraying his disdain. He turned to one of his assistants and murmured something inaudible. The assistant nodded and stepped back, avoiding eye contact with anyone else. Carter continued his slow circuit around the room, exchanging brief pleasantries with a few key figures. His comments were sharp and calculated, laced with the kind of humor that left his conversation partners laughing nervously, unsure whether they had been complimented or insulted. His presence was magnetic, but it carried an edge that kept people on guard. The anticipation of his arrival had turned into a palpable tension. Staff members avoided crossing his path, and even the most seasoned guests seemed careful in their interactions with him. Carter, however, reveled in the unease. He thrived on power dynamics, and tonight was no exception. As the evening progressed, Carter's attention returned to Martha. She was now wiping down the edges of the stage, her focus unwavering despite the growing crowd. Carter paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. To him, she was a contradiction, a presence that didn't belong in this world of opulence. Her very existence in this space seemed, in his mind, an affront to the order he believed in. Carter's lips moved into a faint smirk as he turned back to his assistant, his tone dripping with condescension. The assistant nodded dutifully, scribbling something on a notepad. Whatever Carter had said, it was clear that he intended to make Martha the subject of his attention. The storm was beginning to gather, though most in the hall remained blissfully unaware. For Martha, the evening was just another shift, another night of quiet labor. She couldn't have known that her path was about to intersect with one of the most powerful and abrasive figures in the room. And, for Daniel Carter, this was just the beginning of what he saw as another opportunity to assert his dominance. Neither could anticipate how their collision would reverberate through the night, challenging not just their perceptions of each other, but of the very world they inhabited. The grand hall hummed with activity as more guests poured in, their laughter and chatter growing louder as the evening unfolded. Servers maneuvered through the crowd with trays of sparkling champagne, and the soft strains of live classical music floated through the air. The room radiated opulence, a carefully constructed image of perfection, but beneath the surface, tensions quietly simmered. Martha Brown remained on the periphery, a shadow among the glittering spectacle. Her task this evening was to ensure the hall remained spotless, and she carried it out with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her years of work. She moved methodically, wiping away invisible smudges from the polished floors and straightening chairs that were slightly out of alignment. For Martha, every detail mattered, even if no one else noticed. As the night wore on, Martha found herself near the stage, where the evening's speakers would soon address the crowd. She knelt down to clean a stubborn scuff mark on the marble, her movements slow and deliberate. The effort was taxing on her aging knees, but she ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the task at hand. Unbeknownst to her, Daniel Carter was watching. Carter had positioned himself near the center of the room, surrounded by a small group of high-profile guests who hung on his every word. His sharp, sardonic remarks drew scattered laughter, though the humor often came at the expense of others. His presence was magnetic, but it carried an edge that kept those around him on constant alert. It was during a lull in the conversation that Carter's gaze fell on Martha. Her figure, hunched over the floor, stood in stark contrast to the sleek elegance of the surroundings. Her uniform marked her as staff, but to Carter it symbolized something more, a reminder of the divide between himself and those he deemed unworthy of his attention. For a moment, Carter said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, with a faint smirk, he turned to his assistant and murmured something under his breath. The assistant, visibly uncomfortable, glanced in Martha's direction before nodding and stepping away. Carter's smirk deepened as he approached the stage, his footsteps deliberate. The crowd around him parted instinctively, their conversations quieting as they noticed his movement. When he reached the edge of the stage, he paused, his gaze fixed on Martha. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on scrubbing the floor. It wasn't until his shadow fell across her work that she looked up, startled. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Carter's expression was one of calculated disdain. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. When he finally did, his voice carried a tone of mockery that cut through the air like a blade. Martha blinked, momentarily stunned, but she quickly averted her gaze and resumed her work. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had faced people like Carter before, people who saw her as nothing more than a reflection of her uniform. She knew better than to engage, to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But Carter wasn't finished. His comments grew louder, drawing the attention of those nearby. The faint hum of conversation in the room began to quiet as more people turned to watch the unfolding scene. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked on with morbid curiosity. Martha's face burned, but she refused to look up. She focused on her work, scrubbing the floor with a determination that belied the humiliation coursing through her. Each word Carter spoke felt like a blow, but she had endured worse. She would endure this too. The crowd around Carter began to shift uncomfortably. A few murmurs of disapproval rippled through the room, but no one stepped forward to intervene. The staff watched from a distance, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and helplessness. They knew better than to cross someone like Carter, especially during an event of this magnitude. For Carter, the scene was a game. He reveled in the power he held over the room, the way his words could command attention and silence dissent. To him, Martha was a prop, a tool to assert his dominance and entertain himself. Her silent dignity only fueled his disdain, a challenge to his authority that he couldn't ignore. But what Carter didn't realize was that he wasn't the only one watching. From across the hall, Richard Weston observed the scene with a growing sense of unease. He had been engaged in conversation with a senator when he noticed the commotion near the stage. At first, he thought it was a minor incident, but as Carter's voice grew louder, it became clear that something more serious was happening. Weston's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. He recognized Martha immediately. She had been a loyal employee of the Cultural Center for over a decade. Her work ethic and quiet dignity had always impressed him, even if her contributions often went unnoticed by others. To see her subjected to such public humiliation was deeply unsettling. As Carter continued his tirade, Weston made a decision. He excused himself from the conversation and began to make his way toward the stage. His movements were unhurried but purposeful, his expression calm but resolute. The room was still buzzing with murmurs when Weston reached the edge of the crowd. His presence, though not yet announced, began to draw attention. Those who noticed him stepped aside, their curiosity piqued. Weston's reputation as a man of principle preceded him, and his intervention promised to be significant. Martha, still kneeling on the floor, was the first to notice him. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment her expression softened. There was no mistaking the gratitude in her gaze, though she quickly looked away, not wanting to draw more attention to herself. Weston paused briefly, taking in the scene before him. Carter, oblivious to Weston's arrival, continued his tirade, his voice echoing through the hall. But as Weston stepped forward, the mood in the room began to shift. The air grew heavier, charged with the promise of confrontation. What happened next would not only alter the course of the evening, but challenge the very foundation of the power dynamics Carter had relied on for so long. Weston's quiet authority was about to collide with Carter's unchecked arrogance, and the resulting clash would leave no one in the room unchanged. The murmurs of the crowd grew softer as Richard Weston made his way toward the stage. Unlike Daniel Carter, who commanded attention through force of personality, Weston's presence was quieter, yet equally powerful. He moved with a calm authority that drew eyes not through spectacle, but through respect. His tailored black suit was immaculate, and his every step exuded the confidence of a man accustomed to handling crises. As Weston approached, Daniel Carter remained oblivious, still caught up in his performance. He stood with his back partially to the room, gesturing dramatically as he delivered another cutting remark aimed squarely at Martha. The media mogul's voice carried over the crowd, his words dripping with sarcasm and condescension. His smirk widened at the faint laughter from a few nearby guests, though even they seemed uneasy. Martha, still kneeling near the base of the stage, kept her gaze down, her hands continuing their meticulous work. She had retreated into herself, a survival mechanism honed over years of similar encounters. But the trembling of her hands betrayed the emotions she was struggling to suppress: humiliation, anger, and a deep, unyielding sadness. To her, the marble floor she scrubbed had become both her anchor and her shield. Weston stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning the scene. He noted the tense posture of the staff standing nearby, their faces a mixture of sympathy and fear. He saw the discomfort rippling through the crowd, most of whom chose to avert their eyes rather than confront what was happening. And finally, his gaze rested on Carter, who continued to dominate the space with his cruel performance. Richard Weston was not a man to raise his voice or act impulsively. His power came from his ability to read a room, to understand the dynamics at play and to act decisively without spectacle. He allowed the moment to stretch just long enough for the crowd to notice his presence, a subtle shift in the atmosphere as the attention began to turn from Carter to him. Finally, Weston stepped forward. His polished shoes made a soft sound against the marble floor, a sound that seemed amplified in the growing silence. The few remaining whispers in the room ceased as guests turned to watch. Weston's reputation preceded him. He was known for his unflinching commitment to integrity and fairness, a rare trait among men of his wealth and stature. Carter, sensing the change in the room, paused mid-sentence. He turned to see Weston standing nearby, his expression calm but firm. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across Carter's face, followed by something resembling irritation. He didn't like being interrupted, especially not by someone he considered a rival in influence. Weston's gaze shifted briefly to Martha. He offered her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried an unspoken message. You are not alone. Then he looked back at Carter, his eyes steady and unyielding. The tension in the room was palpable. Weston didn't speak immediately, letting the weight of his presence settle. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was low and measured, but it carried an unmistakable authority that cut through the air like a blade. Daniel, Weston began, addressing him by his first name with a familiarity that felt deliberate, as though to remind everyone in the room that he and Carter stood on equal footing. I couldn't help but notice the scene you've created here. Carter's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He straightened his posture, clearly preparing to defend himself. Richard, he replied, his tone laced with feigned politeness. I didn't realize you were part of the entertainment tonight. The crowd tensed at Carter's response, but Weston remained unfazed. His expression didn't change, and his voice remained calm. This isn't entertainment, Daniel. This is a charity gala, a place where we come together to support those who need it most. And yet, here we are, turning our attention away from the cause and onto something far less worthy. Carter's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Weston raised a hand, silencing him without raising his voice. The gesture was quiet yet commanding, and it sent a clear message. You've had your say. Now it's my turn. Weston continued, his gaze unwavering. You've taken it upon yourself to belittle someone who works tirelessly to ensure this evening runs smoothly. A woman who has spent more years contributing to this community than most people in this room have been alive. And for what? A cheap laugh? A moment of superiority? The room was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the two men. Even those who had been laughing moments earlier now looked uncomfortable, their gazes darting between Weston and Carter. Carter's confidence began to waver. He wasn't used to being called out publicly, especially not by someone of Weston's stature. His smirk faded, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that barely concealed his irritation. But he remained silent, realizing that anything he said would only escalate the situation. Weston shifted his attention to the crowd, his voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the hall. This gala is meant to be a celebration of compassion, a reminder that our wealth and privilege come with responsibility. If we cannot extend basic respect to those who make this evening possible, then we've failed before we've even begun. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The crowd, which had been on edge, now seemed to collectively exhale. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged guilty glances. The shift in the room was palpable. Weston had not only diffused the immediate situation but had also forced everyone to confront their own complicity. Weston turned back to Martha, who had risen to her feet during his speech. Her expression was a mixture of gratitude and humility, though she still avoided meeting his gaze for too long. Weston stepped closer to her, his voice softening. "You've done more for this hall tonight than most of us will in a lifetime," he said, his tone filled with sincerity. "Thank you." Martha nodded, her voice too choked with emotion to respond. She gathered her cleaning supplies and moved toward the edge of the room, her step steady but measured. The crowd parted for her, and for the first time that evening, she felt seen, not as a worker, but as a person. As Martha disappeared from view, Weston turned back to Carter. The mogul's expression was a mask of restrained anger, but he said nothing. Weston didn't gloat or linger. He simply offered Carter a pointed look before walking away, leaving the media mogul to stew in his own discomfort. The room slowly began to return to its rhythm, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter, more subdued. The memory of Weston's words lingered, a reminder of the values the evening was supposed to represent. For Weston, the matter was settled. But for Carter, the sting of public humiliation was far from over. And for Martha, the quiet dignity she carried would serve as a testament to her strength, a reminder that even in the face of cruelty, resilience could shine brighter than any chandelier. The grand hall of the cultural center had resumed its hum of activity, but the air was heavy with the aftershocks of Richard Weston's intervention. Guests murmured among themselves, glancing toward Daniel Carter, whose carefully crafted confidence now appeared to waver. Servers continued to weave between the tables, their movements more deliberate as they tried to avoid the lingering tension in the room. The mood had shifted. The glamour of the evening now carried an undercurrent of unease. Daniel Carter stood near the center of the room, his face a mask of barely restrained irritation. For someone accustomed to commanding respect, or at least deference, being publicly called out was a rare and deeply unwelcome experience. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing to regain control of the situation. His reputation, built on wit and dominance, felt precariously close to unraveling in front of the city's elite. Nearby, a few of Carter's closest associates hovered uneasily, their eyes darting between him and the crowd. They seemed unsure whether to approach or give him space, their loyalty tempered by their awareness of the precarious social dynamics. Carter, sensing their hesitation, waved them off with a sharp gesture. He didn't need sycophants right now. He needed a way to turn the narrative back in his favor. His gaze swept the room, searching for an opportunity to reassert his dominance. He spotted Richard Weston standing near one of the tables, engaged in conversation with a senator. Weston appeared unperturbed, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Carter's simmering frustration. The image only fueled Carter's anger. How dare Weston, a man whose wealth depended on the goodwill of others, publicly chastise him? Carter turned his attention back to the stage where Martha had been cleaning earlier. Though she had left the immediate area, the memory of her presence lingered in his mind. To Carter, she symbolized the cracks in the facade of this evening's perfection, a reminder of the people he deemed unworthy of sharing the same space as him. It wasn't just her uniform or her work that had irked him. It was her audacity to exist in his orbit without acknowledging her supposed inferiority. He strode toward the stage, his movements deliberate and commanding. The crowd noticed his purposeful approach and quieted slightly, their curiosity piqued. Carter's actions had already drawn attention earlier in the evening, and now it seemed he was preparing to make another statement. The guests watched with a mix of apprehension and intrigue, unsure of what was about to unfold. Carter reached the stage and turned to face the room, his posture exuding the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling the narrative. He raised a hand, signaling for silence. The conversations around the hall dwindled, leaving only the faint clink of glasses and the muted footsteps of staff in the background. All eyes were on him now, a position he relished even in the wake of Weston's earlier rebuke. "My friends," Carter began, his voice smooth and commanding. "It seems this evening has taken an unexpected turn. I must admit, I've always admired Richard Weston's flair for the dramatic." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The crowd stirred uncomfortably, their reactions a mixture of amusement and unease. Some laughed nervously, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Weston, still standing by the table, turned slightly, his expression calm but watchful. Carter continued, his voice growing sharper. "But let us not lose sight of what tonight is truly about. This gala is a celebration of achievement, of progress, of excellence. It is a gathering of the best and brightest, those who have risen above mediocrity to make a real impact on the world." His words were calculated, a thinly veiled jab at Weston and indirectly at Martha. The implication was clear. Carter viewed himself and those like him as the true drivers of progress, while others were merely background noise. From across the room, Weston observed silently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, allowing Carter to continue digging his own rhetorical grave. Carter's tone grew more pointed as he addressed the room. "While we all appreciate the hard work of those who make evenings like this possible," he said, emphasizing the word appreciate with a faint sneer, "let us not confuse that work with the true purpose of tonight. We are here to celebrate success, not to indulge in distractions." The tension in the room thickened. Some guests nodded cautiously, unwilling to openly oppose Carter, while others shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the hostility behind his words. The staff, many of whom had been listening from the edges of the hall, exchanged glances, their unease growing. As Carter finished speaking, he stepped down from the stage, his expression triumphant. He had reclaimed the spotlight, or so he believed. The room was his once more, and he reveled in the faint applause that followed, though it was far from unanimous. To him, it was enough, a sign that his influence remained intact. But as Carter returned to his place in the crowd, Weston stepped forward. His movements were unhurried, yet deliberate, and the crowd's attention shifted to him once again. He didn't raise his voice or make any grand gestures. He simply stood near the stage, his presence commanding without effort. Weston spoke calmly, his words carrying the weight of conviction. "Success, Daniel, is not measured by wealth or power. It is measured by the legacy we leave behind, by the lives we touch, and by the respect we show to one another." The room fell silent once more, the power dynamic shifting unmistakably in Weston's favor. Carter's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Weston's words, though spoken with restraint, carried an undeniable weight that cut through the pretense Carter had worked so hard to maintain. Weston continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "Tonight is not just about celebrating what we have achieved. It is about recognizing the efforts of those who make those achievements possible. Every person in this hall, whether they are a guest or a member of the staff, plays a vital role in making this evening what it is." His words resonated deeply, drawing scattered nods of agreement from the crowd. The unease that had lingered after Carter's speech began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of solidarity. For Carter, however, the moment was a bitter pill to swallow. He had lost control of the narrative, his attempt to reassert dominance undone by Weston's quiet but unwavering strength. The humiliation burned, and though he remained outwardly composed, his clenched fists betrayed the anger simmering beneath the surface. As Weston stepped back, the room slowly returned to life, the conversations resuming in hushed tones. But the tension between Weston and Carter lingered, a silent battle of principles that would continue to define the evening. For the staff, Weston's words were a beacon of hope, a reminder that their work mattered and that dignity could prevail even in the face of arrogance. And for Martha, who listened from the edges of the room, it was a moment of quiet vindication. Though the night was far from over, the tide had begun to turn. As the hum of conversation returned to the hall, the guests seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, though the tension lingered like a faint shadow. Servers resumed their duties, weaving between tables with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, but the air carried a subtle charge. The confrontation between Daniel Carter and Richard Weston had left its mark, and while many chose to move on, some couldn't shake the memory of Carter's cruelty, or Weston's resolute response. Near the back of the hall, Martha Brown had retreated to a quieter corner, her cleaning supplies neatly tucked into the cart she had pushed for years. Her hands still trembled slightly, the adrenaline from the earlier encounter refusing to subside. She leaned against the wall, taking a moment to collect herself. The sting of Carter's words lingered, but so did the warmth of Weston's intervention. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a cleaner, but as a person. From her vantage point, Martha could observe the glittering crowd without being noticed. She watched as Weston moved through the room, exchanging polite words with guests and offering warm smiles to the staff. His presence was steady, reassuring, a stark contrast to Carter's brashness. Martha allowed herself a small, grateful smile before turning her attention back to her work. Unbeknownst to Martha, Weston had been watching her from across the room. He excused himself from a conversation and made his way toward her corner. His approach was unhurried, his expression kind but purposeful. As he reached her, Martha straightened, instinctively smoothing the front of her uniform. "Martha," Weston said gently, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Would you mind joining me for a moment? There's something I'd like to share with the room." Martha blinked, her heart skipping a beat. The thought of standing in front of the crowd, of being the center of attention, filled her with a quiet dread. But there was something in Weston's tone, a mix of kindness and resolve, that made it difficult to refuse. She nodded hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Weston offered her a reassuring smile and gestured for her to follow. Together, they walked toward the stage, the crowd parting instinctively as they passed. Murmurs rippled through the room as guests noticed Martha, her presence a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. The chatter grew quieter as Weston stepped onto the stage, guiding Martha to stand beside him. When Weston turned to address the room, his voice carried the same calm authority that had silenced Carter earlier. The hall fell silent almost immediately, every eye fixed on him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Weston began, his tone measured, "tonight we gather here not just to celebrate success, but to honor the values that underpin it: hard work, dignity, and compassion. And in that spirit, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone who embodies these values." He gestured toward Martha, who stood beside him, her hands still clasped tightly. Her face was flushed, but her posture was steady, a quiet dignity radiating from her. "This is Martha Brown," Weston continued. "For over a decade, Martha has been a part of this cultural center. Her work often goes unnoticed, but it is her dedication and tireless effort that allow events like this to take place. Tonight, I want to ensure that her contributions are not only seen, but celebrated." The room was utterly silent, the weight of Weston's words sinking in. Many of the guests who had previously paid no mind to the staff now looked at Martha with new eyes. There was no mistaking the respect in Weston's voice, and it demanded a response. Weston paused for a moment before continuing, his tone softening. "Martha's story is one of resilience and strength. She has faced challenges that would break many of us, yet she continues to carry herself with grace and humility. Her work is not just a job, it is a testament to her character." He glanced at Martha, offering her an encouraging nod before addressing the crowd again. "I share this with you because tonight is about more than raising funds. It is about recognizing the humanity in each of us, no matter our role or station. And it is a reminder that true greatness lies not in wealth or power, but in the respect we show to others." The room erupted into applause, a genuine, heartfelt response that echoed through the hall. Martha's eyes glistened with tears, but she held her head high, her lips curving into a small, grateful smile. For the first time in years, she felt truly valued. As the applause died down, Weston turned to Martha once more. "Thank you, Martha, for everything you do. This evening wouldn't be possible without you." Martha nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Weston." With that, Weston stepped down from the stage, guiding Martha back to her corner. The crowd parted for them again, but this time the expressions were different. There was no pity, no discomfort, only quiet admiration. Back at her cart, Martha watched as Weston returned to the crowd. The warmth of his words lingered, a balm against the sting of Carter's earlier cruelty. She resumed her work, but her movements were lighter, her steps more assured. For the guests, the moment was a turning point. Conversations took on a different tone, less focused on wealth and more on the people who made such evenings possible. The staff noticed the change, too. The looks they received from the guests were no longer indifferent but filled with newfound respect, and for Daniel Carter, who stood on the edge of the room, the moment was a bitter reminder of his failure to dominate the evening. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that betrayed his simmering anger. For the first time in years he felt the sting of irrelevance, and it burned. As the evening progressed, Martha's story became the quiet heart of the gala, a reminder of the values that Weston had championed. And while the event would eventually come to an end, the impact of that moment would linger, challenging everyone in the room to reconsider what true success meant. The applause that had followed Richard Weston's recognition of Martha Brown still seemed to reverberate in the hall, though the event had begun to return to its intended rhythm. Guests were once again sipping champagne and engaging in conversations, but the atmosphere was undeniably different. A shadow of introspection had settled over the room, its origins firmly rooted in the evening's earlier clashes. Amid the glitter and gold, the illusion of unchallenged superiority had been cracked. Daniel Carter stood near the edge of the hall, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand. His face was a carefully constructed mask of indifference, but his clenched jaw and rigid posture betrayed the storm brewing beneath the surface. For a man who had built his empire on commanding attention and asserting dominance, the events of the night had struck a devastating blow. He had miscalculated. What had begun as an attempt to assert his superiority over Martha, a woman he deemed insignificant, had spiraled into a public humiliation at the hands of Richard Weston. The crowd's response to Weston's speech, their applause for Martha, and the quiet admiration that had followed her through the room were not just a rejection of Carter's behavior. They were a repudiation of the values he represented. Carter's closest associates, sensing his mood, kept their distance. They lingered nearby, occasionally glancing in his direction but making no move to engage. They had learned long ago that Carter's temper was best left undisturbed when he was cornered. And tonight, he was very much cornered. From across the room, Weston observed Carter with quiet scrutiny. He was not one to revel in another's defeat, but he understood the importance of holding powerful men like Carter accountable. Weston had seen firsthand how unchecked arrogance could corrode the fabric of society, and he was determined not to let it go unchallenged in his domain. As the evening wore on, Carter's isolation became more pronounced. Guests who had once gravitated toward him now avoided his gaze, their discomfort evident in their hurried movements. Even those who admired his success seemed unwilling to align themselves with him in the wake of his behavior. Carter, for all his influence, had become a pariah in the space he had sought to dominate. Yet Carter was not a man to accept defeat easily. He moved through the hall with an air of forced confidence, stopping to speak with a few guests who were too polite or too intimidated to avoid him. His words were sharp and calculated, his tone laced with the same sardonic edge that had defined his earlier remarks. But the responses he received were subdued, the laughter faint and uneasy. The power he had once wielded with ease now felt hollow, diminished. At one point, Carter found himself near a group of influential donors, their conversation animated as they discussed Weston's speech. He lingered on the outskirts, listening intently. The words stung. "Weston has a way of cutting to the heart of things," one man said, his tone thoughtful. "What he said about respect, it's a reminder we all needed." Another guest nodded. "And Martha, what a remarkable woman. It's humbling, really, to see someone so quietly resilient." Carter's grip on his glass tightened. He turned away, his chest tight with frustration. The narrative of the evening was slipping further and further from his control, and there was nothing he could do to reclaim it. As the gala drew closer to its conclusion, Weston took to the stage once more, his calm demeanor commanding the room's attention. He spoke about the importance of the night's cause, tying it back to the themes of compassion and respect that had defined his earlier remarks. His words were measured, but their impact was profound. Carter stood at the back of the room, his face impassive as he listened. To the casual observer, he appeared unaffected, but inside, his thoughts were a maelstrom. He resented Weston's ability to turn the crowd against him, to frame the evening in terms that left no room for Carter's brand of superiority. And yet, he could not deny the truth of what Weston had said. When the speech concluded, the room erupted in applause once more. Weston stepped down from the stage, his presence a beacon of stability amid the evening's turbulence. Guests approached him with words of gratitude and admiration, their respect for him evident in every gesture. Carter watched from a distance, his isolation complete. The power he had once held over the room had been stripped away, leaving him to grapple with the uncomfortable reality of his diminished influence. For the first time in years, he felt small. As the crowd began to thin and the event wound down, Carter lingered near the exit, his thoughts heavy. He had come to the gala expecting to command attention, to bask in the glow of his success. Instead, he was leaving humbled, his confidence fractured by the night's events. Outside, the crisp night air offered a stark contrast to the warmth of the hall. Carter stepped onto the sidewalk, the noise of the city enveloping him. His car waited nearby, the driver standing attentively by the door. But Carter hesitated, his gaze drifting back toward the glowing windows of the hall. For a moment, he considered returning, finding Weston and attempting to salvage his reputation. But the thought was fleeting. He knew that any attempt to reassert himself would only deepen the damage. With a quiet sigh, he climbed into the car, the door closing with a muted thud. As the car pulled away from the curb, Carter stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white. The night had not gone as planned, and the path forward was unclear. For a man who thrived on control, the uncertainty was unbearable. But for the first time, he was forced to confront a truth he had long ignored. Power without respect was hollow, and dominance without compassion was ultimately self-defeating. Whether he would accept that truth or continue to resist it remained to be seen. In the hall, Weston stood by the stage, watching as the last of the guests departed. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not from Carter's humiliation, but from the knowledge that the evening had achieved something greater than its original purpose. It had sparked a conversation, one that would linger long after the lights were dimmed and the doors were closed. And for Martha, who had quietly returned to her duties, the night was a reminder of her own strength and the power of dignity in the face of cruelty. Though the scars of Carter's words would take time to heal, she carried with her the knowledge that her worth was not determined by the opinions of men like him. The evening had ended, but its impact was just beginning to unfold. The cultural center's grand hall, once filled with the lively chatter and clinking glasses of New York's elite, had grown quieter as the final guests departed. The towering crystal chandeliers still cast their soft, golden light over the space, now almost entirely empty except for a handful of staff finishing the cleanup. The echoes of the evening's events lingered in the air, leaving behind a subtle shift in the atmosphere, one that couldn't be undone. Martha Brown stood near her cart at the edge of the hall, quietly observing the scene. Her body ached from the long night, but her heart felt unexpectedly light. For years, she had worked these events without so much as a glance from the people she served, her presence as unnoticed as the polished floors beneath their feet. Tonight, however, had been different. Tonight, she had been seen, not just as a worker, but as a person of value. She thought back to Richard Weston's words on the stage, his voice firm yet kind as he described her years of dedication. The applause that had followed still echoed in her mind, a sound she never thought she would hear directed toward her. For the first time in years, she felt her work had been truly acknowledged, not as a task, but as a vital contribution. It was a feeling she would carry with her long after the hall was empty. Across the room, Richard Weston stood near the stage, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were thoughtful as he surveyed the space. The evening had gone better than he had anticipated, though not in the way he had originally planned. The gala had raised significant funds for the educational programs it supported, but more importantly, it had sparked something intangible yet powerful, a collective moment of reflection. Weston's gaze drifted to Martha, who was carefully restocking her cart. He admired her resilience, her quiet dignity in the face of adversity. The events of the evening had only reinforced his belief that the true measure of success lay not in wealth or power, but in how one treated others. He had made it a personal mission to ensure that everyone who crossed his path felt valued, and tonight he had seen that mission come to life. As he approached Martha, she looked up, her expression a mixture of gratitude and humility. Weston smiled warmly and spoke in a low voice, ensuring their conversation remained private. "Martha," he said, his tone gentle, "I hope you know how much your work means to this place, to all of us." She nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you, Mr. Weston. It means a lot to hear that." "You've taught us all something tonight," Weston continued. "Your strength, your grace, it's a reminder of what truly matters. And I hope we all leave here carrying that lesson with us." Martha smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She nodded again, unable to find the words to respond, but knowing they weren't necessary. Weston's presence and his actions throughout the evening had spoken louder than any words ever could. As Weston stepped away, Martha resumed her work, her movements lighter, her spirit buoyed by the quiet acknowledgement that her contributions mattered. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter had long since departed, his presence no longer looming over the hall. The memory of his earlier behavior lingered, but it had been overshadowed by Weston's decisive intervention and the crowd's response. Carter's absence felt strangely significant, a symbol of the evening's ultimate triumph of humility over arrogance. For the remaining staff, the night's events had left a lasting impression. Conversations among them carried a new sense of hope and camaraderie, as though Weston's words had reminded them of their own worth. The once invisible labor that sustained these grand events had been brought into the spotlight, if only for a moment, and it was a moment they wouldn't soon forget. As the last of the tables were cleared and the lights began to dim, Weston turned to address the staff gathered near the entrance. His voice carried easily through the quiet hall, his tone both commanding and kind. "Thank you all for your incredible work tonight," he said, his gaze sweeping across the group. "This evening's success is a testament to your dedication and skill. I hope you know how much I, and everyone here, appreciate what you do." The staff responded with nods and murmurs of gratitude, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and relief. Weston lingered for a moment, ensuring his words had been heard before making his way toward the exit. As he stepped into the cool night air, Weston felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The gala had achieved its goals, both tangible and intangible, but more importantly, it had reminded everyone present of the power of respect and compassion. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one, and it reinforced his commitment to the values he held dear. Back inside, Martha wheeled her cart toward the storage room, her step steady and her heart lighter than it had been in years. The applause she had received, the kind words from Weston, and the subtle shifts in the attitudes of the guests had left her with a renewed sense of purpose. Tonight had been more than just another shift. It had been a moment of validation, a reminder that her work and her presence mattered. As the lights in the hall dimmed completely and the doors were locked for the night, the cultural center fell into silence. But the echoes of the evening's events lingered, carrying with them a quiet but powerful lesson. Greatness is not defined by wealth or status, but by the respect we show to those who cross our paths. And perhaps, if everyone carried that lesson forward, the world might feel a little kinder, one moment at a time. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends if it caught your eye and leave your thoughts in the comments. We value your opinion. In the meantime, check out the other videos on the channel to find out even more interesting things. See you soon.